Hello and welcome to the show. If you were to ask me what is the ultimate hypercar, the answer would be simple. The Koenigsegg 1-1. In terms of performance, there is very little that can beat this car. It is absurdly fast, accelerating, has an incredibly high top speed, but most impressive of all is the way that it can go round corners. This car is road legal, let's not forget, yet it'll lap tracks faster than the best track-only efforts from the likes of McLaren and Ferrari. It is a blisteringly quick car, and you would expect it to be terrifyingly difficult to drive. But it isn't. The truth is, of the crazy high-performance hypercars, the 1-1 is probably one of the most accessible, despite the incredible speed, the huge amount of power going through the rear wheels of this. It's remarkably forgiving. You can drive this car without traction control, and even out of the slow speed corners, there is huge amounts of grip. For all this speed, yeah, you would expect it to be a terrifying knife edge that you drive this car on, and you simply don't. It is a remarkable feat of engineering to have so much power in such a light car and yet have it be as drivable as it is. And of course, as I said, as far as road legal cars go, very little is ever going to even remotely get near. A lot of race cars will struggle to get near to the sort of speed that this 1-1 can obtain around a circuit. However, if you were to phrase that question a little differently and ask me what is my favourite of the hypercars, the Koenigsegg would get close, but it wouldn't beat the TVR Speed 12. Yeah, this is a very bonkers and very purple hypercar. I'll be honest, it is not the prettiest of vehicles, especially from the rear. I don't quite know why we have a rear seat instead of a rear bumper. Don't like the tail lights at all either. From the front, it is a considerably better looking car. Everything about this car is pretty much at the top of the crazy scale. In terms of rarity, there is one. Initially, TVR planned to do a run of road legal versions of these cars. However, when a TVR factory driver took one of the prototypes home, he deemed it too powerful and too dangerous for the road. The TVRs that had been marked out to be road cars were converted for race use, and only one survives as a road car. So, yeah, you'll be hard pushed to find much rarer. When it comes to the driving, the TVR is, as you might expect, not as accessible, not as forgiving as the Koenigsegg, but let's face it, that is not exactly surprising. This car officially has 800 horsepower. That is, though, thanks to various restrictors. Nobody knows how much power it could have produced. The engine is TVR's own V12. It is essentially made from two TVR i6s put together. Each individual i6 had 480 horsepower. Theoretically, put together, they'd have 960. When they went to test it, though, they had a 1,000 horsepower rated dyno, which the engine broke. So, nobody knew how much power the engine actually could produce. So that even with this restricted version with just 800 horsepower, let's not forget, that is all going into a car that weighs under 2,200 pounds, a car made in 1998 that doesn't have a giant wing at the back to try and keep it on the road. So as you can imagine, it is a bit of a handful to drive. However, it is brilliant. It is brilliantly exciting because the car feels almost permanently alive. Nothing quite drives like the Speed 12. Certainly at a track like Sonoma that is a very busy circuit at the best of times, the TVR is almost constantly moving around. It is constantly doing something at every point on the circuit. You have got to be fully concentrated to make sure you keep this car on the road. But if you do pay absolute attention, it is incredibly rewarding when you get everything right and you can find that sweet spot. Yes, it is a very fast car, and if you make a mistake in it, you are going to have a very big accident. However, once you have found that sweet spot, you can find ways to push this car a lot harder than you might initially expect an 800 horsepower rear-wheel drive TVR to be able to go. It is, a fantastic joy to drive, a fantastically rewarding car, and bloody fast when you are on that sweet spot. This is an incredibly quick car because, again, let's face it, at the end of the day, it is essentially a GT1 race car made for the road and with more power than it ran. In GT1, the GT1 engines were restricted to about 690 horsepower, so yeah, it was a blisteringly fast car. However, no modern hypercar has ever really got close to the feeling of driving that Speed 12. Question is, today, could the Zenvo... Now, I like the Zenvo ST1, much like the TVR, certainly in terms of appearance. It shares some similar characteristics to the Speed 12. In all honesty, from certain angles, it isn't the prettiest of the hypercars, especially the front. I'm not so sold on the front grille. However, it does also share the fairly simplistic, in terms of approach, with aero. There isn't a huge, crazy splitter at the front, a massive rear wing or massive rear diffusers. If you park this up amongst the McLaren P1s and the LaFerraris of this world, it'll stand out. I like the look. I think it works overall. It looks aggressive, it looks fast, and yeah, it's certainly something unique. The interior is interesting. Interesting to say the least. I mean, the black and yellow is fine. I'm not quite sure about the weird patterns going on the seats and the doors. Also, some of the buttons in the, or kind of underneath the sat-nav bit, look like they've come off a 90s saloon car. In a $1 million hypercar? Sure. However, of course, there is the one big important button that goes in the middle console bit, which I do quite like the bit down the centre. Some nice big meaty buttons, one of which makes noise. It is, as you would expect, certainly not a bad sounding engine in this one. Again, for a $1 million hypercar, you would hope that would be the case. In fact, it is a twin-charged V8. Now, twin charging is my kind of engineering. When you can't decide between having a supercharger on your engine or a turbocharger, you go for both. It's a lesser used, quite difficult often to make work setup, but it is rather different and rather cool. At the end of the day, you're cutting out any form of lag from crazy turbos, and it's certainly powerful. The Zenvo has 1,086 horsepower. That is a lot of power. Okay, again, not quite as much as the Koenigsegg, but that is still a lot of power going through the rear wheels of this car to propel it forward. And statistic-wise, it is right up there with the hypercars of today. 0 to 60 around 3 seconds, top speed. We'll do it over 230 miles an hour. Although those figures, surprisingly similar to the TVR. Again, Speed 12 would do 0 to 63 seconds, top speed around 240. So, you know, it's almost 20 years further down the line, and the Zenvo is not that much faster, certainly in terms of straight line speed. Also, for your very, very expensive hypercar, while officially the engine is made by Zenvo themselves, it shares an awful lot of specifications to a Chevrolet V8. It is basically a tinkered and modified, lot modified engine that you find in a Corvette Stingray. Not necessarily a bad thing at all, do not get me wrong, but there we go. That's essentially where the engine comes from. And then we get to where things start going a little bit awry. You see, while yes, it is very fast in a straight line, as you would expect, when we come to the corners, things are not so good for the Zenvo. The problem is, while yes, it has 1,000 horsepower, it also weighs almost 4,000 pounds. It is nearly twice the weight of that Speed 12. And it does show. It really does show when it comes to the corners, because it is a very awkward car to get around the circuit. There is an awful lot of understeer from this. Plus point, the traction from this car is actually pretty good. You can use a lot of the 1,000 horsepower without too much trouble, which did surprise me. Even when the going gets wet, yes, the car will slide around a fair bit, but oversteer is not a problem because, well, it understeers a lot. The front end really does not want to get turned into any corners, particularly in the brakes. I think they took the brakes from a Ford Fiesta and put them on the Zenvo. Now, the Fiesta brakes are all very good, stopping a Fiesta from 70, but when you have a 4,000 pound Zenvo doing 180 miles an hour, it doesn't slow down. the brakes are really not very good. It doesn't inspire confidence in you to drive this. It inspires confidence for me to go and change my life insurance policy and add death by Danish hypercar, but it doesn't inspire confidence to try and attack a circuit, to try and carry more speed around corners. Certainly not in the same way the Koenigsegg, and not in the same way that the TVR does either. If anything, the way it drives, it feels as if there is a lot of weight over the back and that the front end is slightly lifting up through the corners. It's made worse if you have bumps and you have curbs to run over. At Brands Hatch here, it wasn't as noticeable. Some tracks you'll go to with this car, you can clip curbs and it feels like the back of the car is constantly bottoming out. And that makes it very, very difficult to drive through sort of excessive elevation changes. Quite possible to spin the car if you aren't very, very careful indeed. So you've got to be awake, you've got to be paying very much attention with this one, but even when you find the sweet spot, it is nowhere near as nice to drive as that Speed 12. So, naturally, I was going to have to take it around our Yas Marina test track. As I said, actual traction, get-go off of the line is good in this car, and it is, again, a 1,000 horsepower hypercar. It's going to be fast in a straight line. Have to be very mindful across these curbs through the first chicane. Now, I expected it to have big issues with the curbs at Yas Marina. I think, thankfully, the track is relatively flat, and it wasn't bottoming out, essentially, across these curbs, despite being very, very big curbs. Now, these two fast right-handers were a big concern for the car. It is a quite understeery, a big understeery car through that section. Not so bad through these slow corners. You just really got to make sure you've got the car slowed down enough through here and don't jump on the power too soon, otherwise you'll go flying off into the wall. Make the most of all of that power. Again, another nasty fast right-hander before big stop down towards that last hairpin. It will change direction well enough. Again, you know, it's not going to be beaten by your kind of average everyday sports car, but it is less than cooperative at times, although, as I said, could have been a lot worse across the curbs here at Yas with that, and it runs across the line, of course, very, very quickly indeed. In terms of lap time, it will go into second on our leaderboard. The Zenvo will do a 105.1, a couple of tenths faster than the Lykan Hypersport. The Lykan quite wobbly, very soft suspension on that, and the Zenvo not quite doesn't quite suffer in the same way as the Lykan does, but it is half a second down on the GTA Spano. That's a fair amount of time down. As I said, it's not going to be beaten by the likes of the Lotus 311 or the Jaguar Formula E. The sheer brute straight line speed on the Zenvo is enough to keep it ahead of those cars, but we could well see some upsets with other vehicles later on in this sort of review series going quicker than that Zenvo, because it's such an awkward car to get around the circuit, but it does have the power to make the most of the smaller straights that it comes to. So, overall, you are probably expecting me to tell you that this car is pretty rubbish. It's essentially a modified Corvette engine on a terrible chassis with very little in the way of cornering grip and doesn't really get slowed down, and you would be completely right. Here's the thing. There are much, much better hypercars, but when it comes to a vehicle that I would want to own, this is right up there. No, it doesn't beat the TVR, nor does it beat the Koenigsegg, but it does beat an awful lot of other hypercars. In all honesty, it'd probably be third on my list of hypercars to own. Partly because of the looks. I really like the style of the Zenvo, and again, it is another rare car. There are only going to be 15 of these around. Okay, not as rare as the TVR, but still, it's a very, very exclusive club. It's really quite a dinosaur. In the modern era, with all of these fancy high-tech electronical hypercars that go very, very quickly around the corner, the Zenvo, it doesn't have any of that stuff, and it does show. It is too big, it is too heavy, and doesn't really have enough grip. But there is something about achieving, decent lap times, wrestling this car around a circuit that is quite rewarding. Not quite as much fun as the TVR, but still very rewarding in its own right. I kind of think of the Zenvo as like having a pet dinosaur. There will be people out there who will not understand why you would possibly want one. They are hopelessly impractical, hideously expensive. You can't exactly have them in the house, and neither can you teach them to play fetch or go for a walk down the park. But I would still want one, given the option. I kind of feel like that about the Zenvo. As terrible as it is, as difficult as it is to drive, and as much as there are better options out there, there is something about it. There is something that you can't quite measure about the Zenvo that makes me really, really like the car, and hope that it doesn't get angry at me and try and throw me in a wall.